She was standing barefoot in her kitchen, 7 months pregnant, holding her late mother's recipe, shrimp and grits, the last dish her mom ever taught her to make. Then she heard her husband's voice behind her, calm, rehearsed, cold. "We need to discuss the divorce." The casserole hit the marble floor, but that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part? The woman he was leaving her for was her best friend. The same woman who had just held her hand at her mother's funeral. The same woman who sobbed on her shoulder and swore she would always be there. They had been together for 14 months. They planned this. They waited for her mother to die before making their move. And her husband? He handed her a studio apartment and $12,000 a month from a man worth $800 million because he genuinely believed she was a nobody who wouldn't fight back. He was wrong. So catastrophically, expensively wrong. Because what nobody knew, what even she didn't know yet, was that her mother, the modest piano teacher who drove a 15-year-old car and clipped coupons every Sunday morning, had quietly, secretly built a fortune of $4.2 billion. And she left every last cent to her pregnant daughter. This is the story of a woman who lost everything in a single evening and woke up one of the wealthiest people in the room. The lesson? The people who underestimate you will become the best evidence of how far you've come. Your worth was never theirs to decide. If you've ever been dismissed by someone who should have loved you, this story is for you. Subscribe, hit the bell, and don't go anywhere. We're just getting started.
Eleanor Calloway deliberately raised her daughter with little, understanding that a woman who discovers her own power in hardship will never fear the daylight. This story is for any woman who has been dismissed, who has been misjudged, who has found herself on the floor surrounded by shattered pieces, questioning if she will ever be complete again. You were never insignificant. You just had not realized your own stature. If this resonates with you, if you feel that spark of anger and hope, then this channel is for you. We share tales of women who refuse to be defeated, who get back up, and who reclaim their identity. If you are new here, please hit subscribe and ring the bell so you will not miss what is next. Drop a comment and share if you have ever found your strength when things were at their worst. I read them all, and your experiences shape our future stories. Press the like button, send this to a friend who needs this message, and for more stories like this one, click the video on your screen. It was chosen just for you. Now, let us get into it. The dish slid from Vivian's grasp, exploding on the kitchen floor. Behind her, Grant's voice was steady, too steady. "We have to talk about the divorce." That one word lingered in the air like a bad smell. Divorce. She was standing in their Manhattan penthouse, barefoot and 7 months pregnant, wrapped in her late mother's sweater. The shrimp and grits, her mom Eleanor's special dish, was a mess on the Italian marble, steam rising from it. It had only been 3 weeks. 3 weeks since her mother's funeral. 3 weeks since Vivian stood graveside in Virginia with a white rose as Grant checked messages behind her. She had excused his behavior, thinking he was just clumsy with sorrow, unable to handle grief. She slowly turned to face him. Grant was in the doorway in a dark suit, his tie slightly undone. His jaw had that familiar tightness it got when he had made up his mind about something without her. He set a manila envelope on the counter that separated them. It was thick, formal, the sort of package that reroutes a person's future. "This is for the best," he stated. Vivian's eyes went from the envelope to the ruined dinner, then to her husband of 23 months. He had proposed on a Tuesday, squeezed between 2 business meetings. At the time, she found it charming and impulsive. A man so driven, he could not even wait for a weekend to make her his wife. Now she understood. He was a man who penciled in love like a weekly status update. Why? The question was barely a whisper. She hated how weak she sounded, how her throat constricted, making the word as fragile and broken as the dish at her feet. Grant combed his fingers through his hair. It was a practiced move. She knew because he did it right before every big pitch to investors, a gesture meant to look relaxed, but was completely staged. "We have drifted apart, Vivian. It is obvious," he said. "I need a partner who belongs in my life, who gets what I am trying to achieve. I am your wife. I am having your baby. And I will provide for you both," he countered. "I have already arranged a place for you, a studio on the Upper West Side. It is very nice." A studio? He had already found her an apartment. This was not a discussion. It was a dismissal. Suddenly, small details her mind had been collecting for months clicked into place. The scent on his shirt collar was not her vanilla perfume. It was a sharper, more expensive floral scent. His phone vibrated on the countertop. He quickly flipped it over without checking the screen. Too quickly. "Is there another woman?" she asked. Grant's jaw clenched. His eyes darted to the left for a brief moment, but it was long enough. "That has nothing to do with this," he claimed, but his eyes told the real story. She was an expert on his tells when he was being dishonest. For 2 years, she had learned that face. She knew his eyes moved left when he was avoiding the truth. She knew his nostrils would flare in a tiny way that only the woman sleeping next to him would notice. She lowered herself to the floor, but not to beg. She began to gather the pieces of the shattered dish. Porcelain, a marriage, it was all the same, broken on a fancy floor. She collected the fragments, holding them in her hands, trying to fit them back together as if that could make anything whole again. The baby kicked, a sharp jab under her ribs, a reminder that she was not alone. Grant observed her for a second, then adjusted his tie. "You have until Monday," he said, "to process this and pack your things." He left. The sound of his dress shoes echoed on the marble. The front door opened and then shut. The deadbolt clicked into place. And just like that, Vivian was by herself in a luxury apartment that she never truly considered a home. She remained on the kitchen floor, her pregnant stomach pushing against her legs. A piece of the dish rested in her hand, one side smooth, the other dangerously sharp. She could feel the food hardening on the floor and smell the spices mixed with the lavender candle from earlier. Her mother had always loved lavender. Her phone started to ring. The screen showed the name Delaney Archer, her best friend from college, the friend who was there for her after too many drinks on her 21st birthday, who wept at her wedding, who was by her side when her mother's heart gave out. "Hey, honey," Delaney's voice was a familiar comfort. "How are you doing? Do you need me to come over?" Vivian nearly said yes. The word was on the tip of her tongue, ready to escape just as it had 1,000 times before. "Yes, come. Bring comfort food. Bring your support. Bring your laugh that always made things seem okay." But she stopped herself. There was something about the timing. Delaney had called precisely 11 minutes after Grant left, almost like she was on standby, like she was expecting it. "Maybe," Vivian replied. "I will let you know." She ended the call and placed the phone down. She rested a hand on her stomach, feeling the baby move inside. "It is just us now, little one," she whispered. At that moment, she had no idea that answering that call would have been the most painful part of the entire ordeal. Morning arrived, unwelcome. Vivian had not slept a wink. In the middle of the night, she had moved from the kitchen to the baby's room, pulled by an instinct she could not explain. The nursery was a gentle yellow. She had painted it herself, applying 5 coats one weekend when Grant was away on business. The crib, which she had put together using an online video, stood by the window. Grant had promised to hire someone for the job, but never followed through. She settled into the rocking chair she had found at a Brooklyn flea market. Its familiar creak was a comforting, safe sound. As she rocked, she went over the conversation again and again, analyzing every word and every practiced movement. 23 months of marriage. A Tuesday proposal. What kind of man proposes on a Tuesday? A man completing a task? A man scheduling a wife between a business lunch and a 4 o'clock golf game? She grabbed her phone and found her mother's name, Eleanor Calloway. On impulse, she hit the call button. It rang 4 times. "You have reached Eleanor. Please leave a lovely message." Her mother's voice was warm and dependable. Vivian disconnected and immediately called back, just to hear it again. "You have reached Eleanor. Please leave a lovely message." She clutched the phone to her heart and shut her eyes. The baby gave a soft kick, as if offering comfort. By 9 o'clock, she knew what she had to do. It was a small choice, not the kind that alters a life, but the kind a woman makes when the world collapses under her feet, and she has to know why. Grant's iPad was sitting on the kitchen counter. He had forgotten it, or perhaps he just never imagined she would look. That was Grant's way. He always underestimated her. It was the bedrock of their marriage, his belief that she was too soft, too thankful, too simple to ever question him. She knew his password, their anniversary, October 14th. How ironic. She typed it, and the screen came to life. Opening his messages, the name at the top made her stomach clench. Delaney. Not Delaney Archer, just Delaney. With a red heart icon beside it. The kind of easy closeness that takes months to grow. Vivian scrolled back to the start of their conversation. Her hands were firm, but her breath was shallow. The texts began 14 months ago. Not weeks, not a few months. 14 months. Before their wedding anniversary. Before the pregnancy. Before her mother, Eleanor, got sick. Before all of it, there were nicknames, Baby D, My Girl. There were secret plans for dinners, hotel rooms, and weekends away when Grant claimed he had business in Dallas or a conference in Boston. There were pictures. Delaney, dressed in lingerie, was posing in what Vivian knew was Grant's corner office, the one overlooking Central Park, the same office where he had asked her to marry him, on a Tuesday. She read on, and the messages grew uglier. One from Delaney was dated the day of Eleanor's funeral, the day Vivian stood in a Virginia cemetery as dirt fell on her mother's casket, with tears on her cheeks and her best friend's arm around her. "How much longer do we have to fake this?" Delaney had texted. "I am so tired of being her shoulder to cry on." Grant's reply appeared 3 minutes later. "Soon. Let her get through this, then we make our move." As if Vivian was an old sofa to be moved out, her sorrow a mere problem to be tolerated before she could be thrown away. She had not been imagining things. She knew something was off. The late work nights, the quiet, distracted dinners, the way his face reddened when she reached for his phone, the way he stopped whispering her name in their private moments, the way Delaney always seemed to know his schedule. Deep down, in that place where your instincts reside, she had known. She kept reading, past the secret plans, the pet names, and the pictures, past the elaborate lies and the mechanics of his betrayal. Then, she saw the texts about the baby. Grant's words, in those plain gray bubbles, were chilling. "She can have custody. I do not want a kid making things messy," Delaney had replied with a laughing emoji. A laughing emoji. For her best friend's unborn child, a laughing emoji. Vivian's hands started to tremble so badly that the iPad slipped. She caught it against her stomach. The baby kicked, hard, right where the device pressed into her skin, as if the child could already feel the fight ahead. She locked the screen, then unlocked it, locked it, then unlocked it again, hoping the messages would somehow change into something she could bear. Hoping she might find a different story, one where her husband still loved her, one where her best friend was true, one where that laughing emoji meant anything else at all. But the words stayed the same. They always do. She called Delaney. Not to fight with her, she was not ready for that. She just needed to hear her voice, to compare it to the cold person in the texts, to see how someone could sound so caring while being so cruel. "Hey, Viv," Delaney said brightly. "I was just thinking about you. You really should not be alone. Come over. I will get the guest room ready. We can watch those awful movies you like and eat ice cream from the container." Every word was now a carefully aimed dagger. The fake concern in Delaney's voice, the warmth, it was all an act. An award-winning performance. The woman had been with Vivian's husband for more than a year while holding her hand as her mother died. "Maybe," Vivian replied. "I will think about it." The same answer she gave last night, but now the words felt like a closing door. She ended the call, went to the bathroom, and held the sink as she got sick. This was not morning sickness. She was well past that stage. This was her body physically rejecting the discovery that the two people she trusted most had been lying to her. It was a sickness from the truth. Her body was finally purging the poison it had unknowingly consumed for 14 months. She washed her face and looked in the mirror. 30 years old, 7 months pregnant, dark shadows under her eyes. Her mother's sweater hung loosely on her frame. She did not look like a woman whose life had just been destroyed. She just looked exhausted, like someone who had been tired for a very long time and was only now admitting it. The worst part was not about the affair. It was not the hotel rooms, the lingerie pictures, or the sweet nicknames. The worst part was about her baby, the life growing inside her, a child she already loved more than anything in the world. A laughing emoji. That is what her baby meant to them. She placed her hands on her stomach, feeling the baby shift, feeling its warmth and weight, the absolute miracle of it all. "I am so sorry," she whispered. "I am so sorry. This is the world you are coming into." Then she stood tall, splashed cold water on her face, and dried her hands on a towel still embroidered with Grant's initials. She had work to do. The iPad contained more secrets than she had imagined. Vivian read through the night, not the novels on her nightstand or the parenting books by the crib. She read the digital evidence of her husband's betrayal. What she discovered in the dark, early hours changed her entire future. A folder named Prenup Review was buried in Grant's email. Inside, she found messages between Grant and his lawyer, a man named Douglas Keller, from a firm on Park Avenue. The conversation started shortly after their wedding. Douglas had typed, "Grant, the prenuptial agreement was never correctly filed in court. We must fix this right away. Without a proper filing, the contract is not valid." Grant's answer was short. "I will take care of it." A second email from Douglas arrived 2 months later. "Grant, this is critical. The prenup is still not filed. If this is not corrected, Vivian will have a right to an equal share under New York law." Grant's reply was dismissive. "She is a nobody. She will not put up a fight. Forget about it. A nobody who will not fight." Vivian read that phrase 3 times. The first time, it felt like a shock. The second, a painful recognition. The third, it felt like a spark hitting gasoline she never knew she had. Without a valid prenup, she was entitled to half of Grant's estate, valued at $800 million. His own lawyers had warned him twice, and he had ignored them because he thought she was a nobody who would not fight. His arrogance was his greatest weakness, and she was quickly learning that weaknesses are where secrets like to hide. There was another email thread, this one between Grant and his mother, Celeste Whitmore. Celeste, who had never once asked Vivian to call her by her first name. Celeste, who, for Christmas, gave her a bathrobe monogrammed with Grant's initials instead of her own. Celeste, who looked at Vivian like she was a stain on a pristine tablecloth. Delaney is from a suitable family, Celeste had written. This was the match that should have happened from the start. In this, discreetly, Grant had answered, I am handling it. She will take the studio apartment and be grateful for it. Grateful, as if having her dignity was a privilege she could not afford, as if she was supposed to thank him for the honor of being thrown away. Vivian closed the iPad, placed it back on the counter, then walked into the nursery and sat in the rocking chair. Their wedding album was on a shelf next to the crib. She pulled the heavy, leather-bound book down, the kind of album that costs a fortune, that was more than some people pay for rent. She opened it. The first picture was of her and Delaney in college, their freshman year, sharing a tiny dorm room. They had pushed their beds together that first week because Delaney was terrified of thunderstorms. Half drunk on cheap wine, during their sophomore year, they promised to be each other's maids of honor. It was a pinky swear, a blood oath, the kind of vow that feels unbreakable when you are 20, before you learn what the world can do to promises. She flipped the page. It was Grant's proposal. The photo was taken by his assistant, Vivian. There was Grant, down on one knee in his office, right between meetings. She was in jeans and a top she had gotten on sale. He wore a suit that was worth more than her car. She had thought it was romantic and spontaneous. She had told everyone that he just could not wait. That he pulled her into his office and proposed right there. She had laughed every single time she told that story. She was not laughing now. Now she finally saw it for what it truly was. It was just another scheduled event, a box he needed to check. It was a Tuesday proposal from a man who treated love like another business transaction. On the next page was her mother at the wedding. Eleanor was in a simple blue dress she had made herself, standing next to the cake and smiling. But her eyes, Vivian could see it clearly now in the picture, something she had missed that day. Her mother's eyes looked careful, almost worried. Eleanor's quiet warning came rushing back to her. They were in the church bathroom just 5 minutes before the ceremony. Eleanor had straightened Vivian's veil and said, "He loves what you do for him, Vivian. Make sure he also loves who you are." She had not understood it back then, but she certainly understood now. The final photograph she looked at was Delaney's toast at the reception. She was standing there in a green dress, holding a champagne glass high. Her mascara was a little smudged from happy tears. "To my best friend," Delaney had said, "who deserves the entire world." The room had clapped and laughed. But in the photograph, Delaney's eyes were not looking at Vivian. For just a split second, they were on Grant, and Grant was looking right back at her. Vivian shut the album and put it back on the shelf. She would never need to look at it again. All she needed to do was breathe. Just breathe. She went into the bathroom, turned on the tap, and filled the tub with warm water. Then she got in with all her clothes on. Her mother's cardigan, her maternity dress, all of it. She sank down until the water was up to her chin, feeling it soak through the clothes, heavy and warm on her skin. She floated her hands on her belly. The baby moved, a slow and peaceful turn, completely unaware of the storm happening outside the water. "It's just you and me now, little one," she whispered. "You and me." She stayed in the tub for 20 minutes. There was no crying, no screaming. There was only breathing, the sound of the water, and the quiet, steady rhythm of her baby turning in the warmth. When she finally stood up, she was dripping all over the marble floor, making a huge mess in Grant's perfect bathroom. She did not care. She wrapped a towel around herself and walked to the front door, leaving a trail of wet footprints behind her. The doorbell rang. A courier, a young man who looked barely 20, stood in the hall holding a thick, legal envelope. It was from a law firm she had never heard of, Hargrove, Price, and Associates. She signed for the package, closed the door, and just stood there, dripping, with the envelope in her hands. Inside was a letter for Vivian Calloway, the sole surviving heir of Eleanor Hargrove Calloway. Hargrove. That was her mother's maiden name. It was a name Eleanor never, ever spoke about. It was not part of any of the stories she told. Not the one about meeting Vivian's father at a jazz club, or the one about why she became a piano teacher. It was not in the story about the little 2-bedroom apartment where she raised Vivian on her small salary and a garden full of tomatoes. The letter was a request for her to be present for the reading of her mother's full estate. It had words Vivian did not recognize, like substantial holdings, controlling interest, and fiduciary responsibility. Her first impulse was to throw it away. It was just another legal paper, another man in a suit trying to take something from her or give her something she never asked for. But that name stopped her. Hargrove. There was something about that name, something important. It felt like a locked door she had been walking past her whole life, never knowing a secret room was on the other side. She placed the envelope on the kitchen counter, right next to the divorce papers. There were 2 envelopes, one from the man who wanted to get rid of her, and one from the mother who, it seemed, had hidden an entire world from her. She did not open it right away. She had to choose between her pride and her safety, her dignity and her child's future. It felt impossible to give up either one, yet impossible to have both. She stood in her kitchen, her wet cardigan dripping onto the floor, and just stared at the 2 envelopes. The prenuptial agreement, the one meant to leave her with nothing, had never been filed. And this envelope from her dead mother's lawyers could change her entire life, but not tonight. Tonight she was just a woman, 7 months pregnant, standing in a puddle she had made, just trying to figure out how to breathe again. She called the law firm the very next morning. Her fingers were shaking as she dialed the number on the letter. She was expecting to get a receptionist. She expected a cold, automated voice, the usual runaround you get from law offices. Instead, a man picked up on the second ring. His voice was warm and calm, the kind of voice that made you feel like he had all the time in the world just for you. "Malcolm Price," he said. "This is Vivian Calloway. I got a letter about my mother's estate." There was a pause, but it was not awkward. It was like he was choosing his words carefully, like a doctor about to give you news that will change your life forever. "Vivian, I was hoping you would call. Your mother talked about you all the time. She was so very proud of you. You knew my mother. For over 30 years, she was a truly remarkable woman. May I ask, did Eleanor ever talk to you about the Hargrove family?" Vivian sat down on the side of her bed, and the mattress creaked under her. Outside the window, the city of Manhattan sparkled in the morning sun. It looked beautiful, indifferent, and cruel all at once. "No," she said. My mother was just a piano teacher. She lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment in Virginia. She drove a 15-year-old car. She would clip coupons out of the Sunday newspaper. She made soup from leftover vegetable scraps. She never, ever mentioned a Hargrove family. Malcolm Price was quiet for a second. Then he spoke, and the words he said completely shattered everything Vivian thought she knew about her own life. "Your mother was the oldest daughter of Franklin Hargrove, the founder of Hargrove Industrial. It is one of the biggest privately owned companies in the southeastern United States. She left the family when she was 22, changed her name, married your father, and chose a very different life. But she never walked away from her inheritance." Vivian sat down hard. The entire room seemed to tilt. The baby kicked, and for a second she could not tell if the dizziness was from the news or from her baby pressing on her ribs. "I do not understand," she said. "Your mother kept her shares in Hargrove Industrial through a very carefully planned trust. She even added to it over the years with smart investments, all managed by her brother, Theodore Hargrove. She also started a foundation for music education in poor communities. She did all of this very quietly, on purpose. Your mother was probably the most private, wealthy person I have ever had the honor to represent." "How much?" Vivian asked. The question felt silly, like asking how deep the ocean is when you are standing on the beach with your toes in the water. "The total estate is valued at roughly $4.2 billion. The number did not even seem real. It just sat in her ear like a word in a foreign language. $4.2 billion. The woman who fixed her jeans with patches from old curtains. The woman who worked 10-hour days teaching piano to kids whose parents could not afford fancy lessons. The woman who cried when Vivian got a full scholarship to college, saying, 'Now you will not have to worry, baby.' $4.2 billion. Vivian's first feeling was not joy or relief, or even shock. It was pure anger. "She never told me," she said. Her voice tight and controlled, like a dam holding back a flood. "My whole life, I worked 2 jobs to get through college. I wore clothes from thrift stores. I ate instant noodles for dinner 4 nights a week. She watched me struggle my entire life, and she never said a single word. She wanted you to know who you were without the burden of money," Malcolm said gently. "She saw what it did to her own family. Her father used his wealth like a weapon. Her brother Theodore became a product of his money. Eleanor wanted something completely different for you. She wanted you to have a solid foundation that could not be bought or sold. She was planning to tell me. She was. She had a whole plan for after the baby was born. She wrote you a letter. It is with all the estate documents. Would you like me to read it to you, or would you rather read it for yourself?" "Send it to me," Vivian said. "Please." The letter came in an email 20 minutes later. Vivian went and sat in the nursery to read it, with its pale yellow walls, the crib she had put together herself, and the rocking chair that creaked just right. She opened the email and tapped on the attachment. Her mother's handwriting filled the screen, a scanned letter written in the same careful cursive Eleanor always used for important things. There were birthday cards, school permission slips, and grocery lists for Thanksgiving. "My dearest Vivian," the letter started, "if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and I am sorry I never told you this in person. I left the Hargrove name because wealth turned people cruel. Your grandfather and your uncle measured love in terms of leverage. I wanted you to know that your value is not a number, but this money is now yours. Use it to be independent. Use it to be kind, and if anyone ever tries to make you feel small, remember that you were never small. You just never realized how tall you could stand. All my love, Mama." Vivian read it once, then a second time, and a third, letting every word find its rightful place inside her. She cried then, for the first time since the funeral. Not the polite, controlled crying from the cemetery, dabbing her eyes while Grant checked his phone. This was a complete, open sob. It was a deep, guttural cry that racked her entire frame, a sound of pure animal agony. She wept for her mother, the woman whose love was strong enough to let her find her own way, to leave her a fortune, to choose a simple life over a toxic one. Her mother gave her the only gift that money could never purchase, the solid ground of knowing who she truly was. She refolded the letter on its old creases, holding it tightly to her chest. She rocked herself back and forth, just as her mother did during thunderstorms. Just as she would one day rock her own child. She swayed until the sobs subsided, and a warm quiet replaced the hollow emptiness. My mother hid this to protect me, she thought, because she loved the person I was becoming. The baby kicked. Vivian let out a watery, ragged laugh that was half sob, half pure joy. She placed her hands on her stomach. Your grandmother, she whispered, was the most incredible woman who ever lived, and she gave us everything, absolutely everything. Lummed. She remained seated for a very long time, breathing, feeling the staggering weight of $4.2 billion settle on her. It felt like a heavy coat she never realized was hers. Finally, she took her phone and dialed Malcolm Price. Malcolm, she said, I need this to be completely private. No press releases, no announcements, and no communication with my husband or his lawyers. Of course. May I inquire why? Because, she answered, I want to discover who people truly are when they believe I have nothing. A moment of silence passed. Then Malcolm gave a soft, respectful chuckle. It was the laugh of a man who instantly recognized Eleanor Hargrove's daughter. Your mother, he said, would be exceptionally proud. Grant called on Thursday morning. His tone was all business, efficient, the same one he used with handymen and cleaning crews, people he considered beneath him. I need you gone by Friday, he stated. I have a guest moving in for the weekend. A guest. He lacked the basic courage to say her name, to offer even a shred of honesty. A guest. I have set up $12,000 a month in temporary support, he went on. It is generous, given the situation. My lawyer will forward the documents. $12,000 a month from a man with a net worth of $800 million. The calculation was almost comical. It was like a king tossing a single copper coin to a homeless person and expecting a show of gratitude. Fine, Vivian said. I will be out by Friday. Good. I am glad we can handle this like adults. Adults, as if betrayal and desertion were markers of maturity, as if leaving his pregnant wife 3 weeks after her mother's funeral was just a logical decision. She ended the call and stood in the kitchen. She looked around the penthouse she had occupied for almost 2 years, at the furniture she never picked, the art she could not appreciate, and the view of Central Park that never felt like it was hers. Let him believe I am shattered, she thought. Let him think I am thankful for his scraps. He has no idea I could purchase his whole company and turn it into a parking garage. But she would not do that. That was not the person her mother had raised. Eleanor Calloway did not raise a daughter to tear things down. She taught her to build, to grow things, to play Chopin until the music seeped into the empty places where sorrow once resided. Friday arrived. Vivian reached the penthouse at 10 in the morning, carrying a single suitcase and 0 expectations. What she walked into was far worse than she could have ever conceived. Delaney was there, inside the penthouse, wearing Vivian's robe. It was the white silk one with lace trim that Eleanor had given her for Christmas 2 years prior. She was sipping coffee from Vivian's mug, the blue ceramic one with the chipped handle that read, World's Okayest Mom. A joke gift from a colleague at the nonprofit where she volunteered before she got pregnant. The nerve was astounding. It was not just the cheating, not just the deception, but the effortless way Delaney took possession. She stood in Vivian's kitchen, wearing Vivian's robe, drinking from Vivian's cup, as if she already belonged there, as if Vivian were the intruder. Vivi, Delaney said, putting the mug down. She moved in for an embrace, a practiced pose of comfort, the familiar choreography of best friends they had acted out 1,000 times. I am so sorry. I never wanted this to happen. I know this must be incredibly difficult for you. The words were flawless, the delivery perfect. If Vivian had not seen the text messages, she might have actually believed her. She might have collapsed into that hug, cried on that shoulder, and never realized that shoulder belonged to the woman having an affair with her husband and mocking her unborn child. When did it begin? Vivian asked. Her voice was level and calm, like a frozen pond in winter. A flicker of something crossed Delaney's face, a tiny crack in the perfect facade. What do you mean? When did what begin? 14 months. I saw the messages. The blood drained from Delaney's face, then rushed back, but her expression was different, harder. The shift was immediate, like watching someone pull off a mask they did not realize they were wearing. Fine, Delaney said, her voice altering as well. The warmth vanished, replaced by a tone that was sharp, brittle, and cold. You want the truth? He was never really yours to begin with. We had a connection on a plane you could never understand. I am sorry, this is how you found out, but frankly, you should have known it was coming. I deserved better than this, Vivian stated. It was not a question or a beg for sympathy, but a simple declaration of fact, like saying water is wet or the sky is blue. I deserved better from both of you. Grant entered the room then. He had been in the bedroom, heard the argument, and now walked into the kitchen with the assurance of a man who owned the entire building and everyone in it. Let us not make this messy, Vivian, he said. Vivian. Her full name. Not Vivi, not honey, not anything affectionate. It was a formal, clinical distance, the name you use for a person you are surgically removing from your life. He stood beside Delaney, their shoulders touching, presenting a united front. The husband and the best friend standing together in Vivian's kitchen, in her robe, telling her not to cause a scene. She stared at them for a long moment, studying their posture, the way Grant's hand rested on the small of Delaney's back. She observed the way Delaney leaned against him, both possessive and putting on a show. They appeared like a couple, a genuine couple. And that was the detail that stung the most. It was not that this was occurring, but that it had been going on for so long, they had already grown comfortable in their roles. Vivian packed only one suitcase. She left the jewelry, the designer outfits, and the shoes that cost more than her mother's monthly rent. She left every single thing Grant had ever bought for her, because none of it truly belonged to her. It never had. She took just 4 items: her mother's cardigan sweater, the baby's first sonogram picture, Eleanor's heavy cast-iron pan, and the letter from Hargrove, Price and Associates. The doorman, Roberto, stood near the elevator with his hands clasped. He had known Vivian for 2 years, had helped with her groceries, and told her silly jokes in his broken English as she waited for a taxi. He looked completely heartbroken. Mrs. Whitmore? He whispered, you are worthy of so much more. She gave his hand a gentle squeeze. I know, Roberto. I finally understand. The elevator doors slid shut. The floor numbers began to descend. 27, 26, 25. Each number represented a layer of the life she was shedding. By the time she got to the main floor, she was no longer Grant Whitmore's wife. She was Vivian Calloway, daughter of Eleanor, and she was finished with being small. She sat inside her car in the parking garage for a very long time. She did not start the engine. She just sat with her hands on the steering wheel. The leather felt cool on her palms. The baby kicked, pressing against the seatbelt. Through the front window, she saw people walking by. There were couples holding hands, a woman with a baby stroller, and an old man with a little dog. Everyone was carrying their own invisible burdens. Everyone was moving on. She did what she always did when her world collapsed. She packed a single bag, left what could be replaced, and took only what could not be bought. She started the engine, drove out of the garage, merged with the flow of traffic, and headed south to Virginia, toward her mother's vacant apartment. It was the only place that still felt like a home. The apartment was filled with the scent of lavender and lemon furniture cleaner. Vivian stood at the entrance and inhaled deeply. The smell was so potent, so real, that for a single, crazy second, she thought her mother was still there. She imagined Eleanor in the kitchen, humming a Chopin piece, wiping the counter with the same yellow cloth she had used since Vivian was a little girl. But the apartment was still, and the quiet confirmed she was alone. She walked inside, shut the door, and placed her suitcase near the coat stand. Eleanor's navy blue wool coat was still hanging there, a button missing from its left cuff. The piano stood by the window. It was a Baldwin upright, nothing fancy or expensive, but it produced the most wonderful tone Vivian had ever heard. Eleanor always said pianos were like people. The prettiest ones were not always the best. The best ones had been played long enough to discover their own voice. A book of sheet music was still open on the stand. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Opus 9. Number 2. It was her mother's favorite. She played it every single evening, right after dinner. The melody would float through their small home like a bedtime story, and Vivian would drift off. Certain all music came from her mother's hands. Eleanor's reading glasses were on the kitchen counter, beside a crossword puzzle. She had not finished. It was Tuesday's newspaper. She passed away on a Wednesday. Vivian moved from room to room, touching every surface. She ran her hand over a bookshelf, holding a beloved copy of Pride and Prejudice. Its spine cracked from use. She touched the windowsill where Eleanor grew herbs in little pot. Basil, rosemary, thyme, all of them were now dead, brown, and dry. No one had been there to water them. She pulled open drawers without searching for anything in particular, simply looking. It was the way you sift through someone's life after they're gone, hoping to find the person they were when you were not around. In the bedroom closet, she discovered an old, locked cedar box. The wood was dark and polished smooth from years of handling. She tried to open it, but the latch was stuck. Using a hairpin from Eleanor's vanity table, she carefully picked the lock. Inside were photographs, but not the kind you put in frames. They were the kind you keep hidden. A young woman in a gorgeous white dress stood on the steps of a grand mansion. The woman was striking, with dark hair, a strong jawline, and eyes that seemed to see right through you. It took Vivian a second to recognize her own mother, Eleanor Hargrove, at maybe 20 years old. She was standing in front of a house that looked like a museum, with columns, fountains, and a circular driveway. A car that cost more than a small house was parked there. Behind her stood a stern, silver-haired man in a suit, his hand resting on a younger man's shoulder. It was her grandfather and her uncle, the family Eleanor had left behind. Underneath the pictures was a newspaper clipping from 1978, announcing Eleanor Hargrove's debut at the Richmond Cotillion. Her mother was in a white ball gown with gloves up to her elbows, smiling from ear to ear. She looked like royalty, like a person Vivian had never known. Her mother was a debutante. The woman who had taught her to make soup from kitchen scraps had once worn elegant white gloves to a formal ball. The woman who drove a 15-year-old sedan had once stood on the steps of a mansion. The woman who carefully clipped coupons had once been worth billions. Vivian sat on the floor of the closet, clutching the photos to her chest. The tears would not come. She was in a place beyond crying, where your body is too worn out to show emotion, and your mind is too crowded for a single clear thought. Darkness fell. The apartment was cold because Eleanor had been thrifty. even with the heat. The thermostat was set to 55 degrees. Vivian turned it up. But the ancient furnace just groaned and sputtered, producing only a weak, lukewarm breath. She covered herself with every blanket she could find, including her mother's quilt, a wool throw from the sofa, and the Afghan Eleanor's book club had knitted one winter. The baby was active, twisting and kicking in a way that felt insistent. At 2 in the morning, the contractions began. They were quick and sharp, like a fist tightening deep inside her. She lay on her mother's bed, with her knees bent, her hands on her stomach, trying to recall everything she had read. She remembered reading about Braxton Hicks' contractions. They were practice contractions, the body just preparing for the real event. They were not supposed to be a danger, especially not at 7 months pregnant, but alone in a cold apartment, with no one to call and no one to comfort her, not usually, felt like possibly. And possibly felt like certainly, which felt like the entire world was ending. She was utterly alone. She had no husband, no best friend, and no mother. She was in a cold apartment, surrounded by the belongings of a woman who was gone, with her baby trying to come into the world 2 months too soon, and there was not a single person on earth who knew where she was. She dialed the only number that came to mind. Dr. Nadia Harmon's emergency line. She was her obstetrician, the woman who had been with her for every ultrasound, every blood test, and every worried question about what was normal. Dr. Harmon, said a clear, calm voice, "It's Vivian Calloway. I am having contractions. I am only 7 months pregnant, and I am all alone. Okay, Vivian, listen to me. I need you to breathe slowly, in through your nose and out through your mouth. Count to 4 for each breath. Can you do that for me?" She did as she was told. In, 2, 3, 4. Out. 2, 3, 4. The contractions started to fade. They were not gone, but they were gentler, the fist inside her slowly unclenching. "Good," Dr. Harmon said. "You are doing great. These sound like Braxton Hicks. Your body is just practicing. The baby is safe, and you are safe, but I want you to come in tomorrow morning so we can check on everything. Can you do that?" "Yes," Vivian whispered. "Thank you." She hung up the phone and lay on her mother's bed, staring at the ceiling. The paint was peeling in one corner, and there was a water stain that looked like a hand. She had never seen it before, after all those nights sleeping in this very room as a little girl. She had never bothered to look up. It seems everyone leaves. My father left before I could even walk. My mother left because her heart gave out. My husband left because his heart was never really with me. My best friend left because she wanted the life I had. What life is that? I have a baby who does not know yet. She does not know that the world is filled with people who leave. At 3:17 in the morning, she picked up her phone and typed, "Can you survive a divorce while pregnant?" into the search bar. She deleted it. She typed, "How to be a single mother." She deleted that too. Then she typed, "I feel so alone." She stared at the words, then erased them. She placed the phone face down on the pillow, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and closed her eyes, just waiting for the sun to rise. Morning always arrives. A soft but steady knock on the door woke her up. It was the kind of knock someone makes when they have been knocking for a while and have no plans to leave. Vivian opened the door and saw a woman standing there. She was in her mid-50s, with short silver hair and kind brown eyes. She held a paper grocery bag and a thermos of coffee. She was wearing a flannel shirt and work jeans, with real mud on her boots and calluses on her hands. It was Ruby Bennett, Eleanor's sister-in-law. It was Vivian's aunt. She was the woman who had married Eleanor's brother before he disappeared. The woman who had stayed in Eleanor's life, the woman who drove all the way from North Carolina every Thanksgiving to argue about the right way to make cornbread and to teach Vivian how to fish. "Aunt Ruby," Vivian said, surprised, "your mama would come back to haunt me if I let you stay in this cold apartment all by yourself," Ruby said. She moved past Vivian and into the apartment. She put the groceries on the counter, opened the thermos, and poured 2 mugs of coffee. Then she started cracking eggs into a bowl. She did not ask a lot of questions. She did not need explanations. She did not say, "I heard about Grant," or "Malcolm Price called me," or even, "How are you doing?" She just started cooking. She turned up the heat, opened the curtains, and filled the dark room with light. When the omelet was done, she placed it on a plate in front of Vivian and sat down with her. She took a sip of her coffee and looked at Vivian with eyes that had seen enough to know that sometimes words are not what you need. "I know about the money," Ruby said. "I know about Grant. And I know you are much stronger than you think you are. But right now, you do not have to be strong. Right now, you just have to eat this omelet." Vivian finished the omelet. It was the first proper meal she had eaten in 3 days. It had the taste of butter, onions, and feeling safe. Ruby told the story just as she told all stories, direct, without any added drama or attempts to soften the details. They were at Eleanor's kitchen table, drinking their second cups of coffee, and Ruby laid out the Hargrove family history as if she were dealing a hand of cards, with every one of them face up. "Your grandfather, Franklin Hargrove, built Hargrove Industrial from absolutely nothing," Ruby explained. "He began with a little machine shop in Roanoke. By the time he reached 50, he owned factories across 6 states. He was a genius, and he was completely ruthless. He used his money the same way other men use their fists." Vivian listened intently. The baby was still, as if it were listening too. "Your grandmother Alice stayed with him, because that is what women did in those days. She would smile at social events, take pills to get to sleep, and never once raised her voice above a whisper in her own home." Eleanor was the oldest of 3 children. Your Uncle Theodore was the middle child, and your Aunt Patricia was the baby of the family. Patricia passed away at a young age in a car crash, or so the newspapers claimed. Ruby paused to take a sip of her coffee. Eleanor was unlike the rest of them. She was intelligent and kind, but felt trapped. Franklin wanted her to marry a banker's son from Richmond, a business deal presented as a wedding. Eleanor refused. Franklin disowned her in public, at a dinner party with 40 guests, telling her she would be nothing without the Hargrove name. She left, Vivian said softly. She left that very night, at 22 years old, with just a suitcase and her piano music. She changed her last name, found a job teaching music in a public school in Arlington, and met your father in a jazz club. They married 6 months later, and then you were born. Your father left when you were little. Eleanor raised you by herself. "Now, about the money," Ruby said, leaning in. "Your mother was gentle, but she was not naive. She never officially gave up her inheritance. Franklin had made the trust permanent, so she could not be legally removed. The money just sat there, growing. And so, Eleanor let it grow. She made quiet, brilliant investments. Theodore managed them, though he hated it, because the trust demanded family supervision, and Eleanor was still family, regardless of what Franklin thought. Vivian said she discovered this in Malcolm's papers. The Eleanor Callaway Foundation, dedicated to music education in rural areas, with a $200 million endowment. She funded it all anonymously. No one ever knew. The children who took piano lessons from those programs, the teachers who received new instruments for their schools, none of them had any idea that the person behind it all, lived in a simple, two-bedroom apartment, and drove a 15-year-old car. Ruby smiled, a look that was a perfect mix of pride and sorrow. Ruby said, "She was the wealthiest piano teacher in America and the happiest woman I ever knew." The doorbell chimed. Malcolm Price was standing on the doormat, a tall, slender man with graying temples. He was dressed in a dark suit and held a leather briefcase that looked as if it had witnessed decades of serious discussions. He took Vivian's hand in both of his, holding it a little longer than usual. "You look just like her," he said softly. They gathered at the table, Vivian, Ruby, and Malcolm. Malcolm then opened his briefcase. The documents were filled with complex legal terms and numbers with too many zeros, but Malcolm patiently walked her through every detail. The inheritance, its full magnitude, was spelled out in black ink on white paper. It included a controlling interest in Hargrove Industrial, worth about $2.8 billion, covering factories, distribution centers, and supply lines across the Southeast. There were real estate holdings in 6 states valued around $900 million, which included office buildings, shopping centers, apartment buildings, and land. An art collection worth $300 million featured paintings by artists Vivian knew from museum trips with her mother, who never mentioned she owned them. And finally, the Eleanor Callaway Foundation, a $200 million endowment that supported music programs in 300 schools across 12 states. There was also a trust set up just for Vivian's children, which would activate the moment they were born. The grand total was $4.2 billion, left by a woman who patched her own clothes and grew tomatoes on a fire escape. "There is one more thing," Malcolm added. "Your uncle, Theodore Hargrove, wants to meet you. He and Eleanor were estranged for decades, but he always honored her financial requests. He is 78 now and has no children. You are the last Hargrove heir. My mother gave me something far more valuable than $4 billion, Vivian said quietly. She gave me a life where I learned who I was without it." Malcolm gave a slight nod. Ruby gently squeezed her hand. Then Vivian did something Grant would never have understood. Not in a million years. She did not call a real estate agent. She did not call a private jet service. She did not call anyone except Grant's lawyer. Not Grant himself, but his lawyer, Douglas Keller, at the Park Avenue office. "Mr. Keller," she said, "I have just one question. Is the prenuptial agreement between Grant Whitmore and Vivian Callaway officially on file with the court?" There was a long silence on the other end, filled with the sounds of typing, a drawer sliding open, and papers rustling. Another long silence followed. "I will have to get back to you about that," Douglas Keller finally said. His voice had changed completely. The confidence was gone, replaced by something that sounded very much like fear. Vivian ended the call and smiled for the first time in weeks. She did not need to fight over the prenup. She had $4.2 billion. But she wanted Grant to feel that fear, just for a little while. She wanted him to know the feeling of the ground giving way beneath him. When the walls you have built are revealed to be made of paper. She went to her mother's piano and pressed a single key, middle C. The note rang out, clear and pure, through the apartment. She let it fade away, then pressed it again, with more force this time. The sound filled the space like a voice, returning after a long period of silence. 2 weeks changed everything. Vivian worked quietly. That was the most important part, to be quiet. No big announcements, no angry arguments, no dramatic late-night phone calls. She just let the system work and let the lawyers do their jobs. She let the truth come out the way it always does, slowly at first, and then all at once. She hired Malcolm Price and his firm. They filed a countersuit in the divorce, claiming adultery, emotional cruelty during her pregnancy, and the fact that the prenup was invalid. She requested half of Grant's estate. She did not need it, and she did not want it, but she wanted him to know that calling her a nobody was the most expensive thing he had ever written. Grant was served the papers on a Monday morning. He called her at 11:15. His voice was different. It was no longer rehearsed or calm. The smooth surface had cracked, revealing pure panic underneath. "What game are you playing?" he demanded. "You are nothing before me." Vivian held the phone to her ear. She was in Eleanor's kitchen. Ruby was at the stove, making cornbread. The scent of butter and cornmeal filled the apartment with a feeling of home. "I was everything before you," Vivian said. "I just forgot." She hung up the phone. Ruby kept her eyes on the cornbread, but she smiled. Owen Merritt called her the following day. He was Grant's business partner, the man who had co-founded their real estate development company 8 years prior. Owen was the one who handled the real work, managing the projects, the finances, and the relationships with contractors and city officials. Grant was just the public face, the deal maker whose name was on the building. "Vivian," Owen said, his voice cautious and deliberate, "I felt you should know. I have seen some things that worry me. Grant has been hiding money, moving it into offshore accounts, and using company money for personal things. He bought a car for someone last month, and it was not for you. He is making bad deals to try and cover his tracks. I am not happy with where the company is headed." "Thank you, Owen," she said. "I really appreciate you telling me this." "He is not the man I started this business with," Owen said. "I am not sure he ever was." She passed this new information to her lawyers. It was another piece of the puzzle, another brick in the wall of a truth that was closing in on Grant Whitmore. The confrontation finally happened on a Wednesday night. The restaurant was named Margot's. It was a French place, expensive, with white tablecloths, candlelight, and a wine list as long as a short novel. It had once been their special place, hers and Grant's. It was where they had anniversary dinners and celebrated big moments. The table by the window was where he had once held her hand and told her she was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Grant chose the location on purpose. It was a power move on his home turf. He also brought Delaney with him, another power move. Delaney wore a new engagement ring, a huge cushion-cut diamond on her left hand. She showed it off like a soldier displaying a war medal, a sign of her victory. But Vivian's arrival was different. She was well rested for the first time in weeks. She had been sleeping soundly thanks to Ruby's cooking, Dr. Harmon's comforting words, and her mother's apartment. That combination had given her something money could not buy. It had reminded her of who she was. She wore a simple black dress and her mother's pearl earrings. She wore no jewelry from Grant, no designer clothes, no armor. She was just herself. She ordered sparkling water, sat down across from them, and waited. Grant was the first to speak. He always was. "Let's get this over with," he said. "Sign the agreement, and take the apartment, and take the $12,000 a month. Be sensible." "I have a different offer, Vivian," Vivian said. Her voice was strong and steady. It was a voice she barely recognized as her own, but one her mother would have known instantly. "You will give me what I am legally entitled to, since there is no valid prenup, and in return, I will not bring up the adultery." Grant's face turned completely white, not red, not flushed, but white. It was the color of a man who has just realized the winning card he was betting on was never even in his hand. "What are you talking about?" he stammered. "The prenup was never filed. Your own lawyer confirmed it last week." "She is bluffing," Delaney said, a little too quickly. Vivian looked straight at Delaney for the first time since that day in the penthouse. She saw the woman who had been her best friend, and she saw her for who she really was. She felt no anger, no hatred, But something much worse. Nothing at all. I am not, Vivian said, and I never was. Grant completely lost his temper. His hand slammed down on the table. The wine glasses shook. The entire restaurant fell silent as people turned to look. A waiter nervously came to the table. Grant snarled at him, truly snarled like a dog whose bone was being stolen. Delaney grabbed his arm and tried to calm him down. Her face was tense and afraid, not of Vivian, but of Grant. She was seeing the version of Grant she was about to marry, the controlling and angry one who pounds on tables, growls at waiters, and calls his pregnant wife a nobody. Delaney was getting a glimpse of her future, and it was not what she had signed up for. The waiter brought the bill. Vivian signed for it. Her hand was perfectly steady. She stood up, gave them a slight nod, and walked out of Margot's for the very last time. The consequences were instant. Grant hired a new lawyer, an aggressive and expensive one who filed legal motions like a machine gun fires bullets, fast, loud, and meant to cause as much damage as possible. Celeste Whitmore called Vivian that same evening. The call was only 45 seconds long. "You will not ruin my son's reputation," Celeste said, her voice like broken glass. Every word was sharp and polished. "We will destroy you." "Mrs. Whitmore," Vivian answered, "your son destroyed himself. I am just planting flowers on the grave." She ended the call. Celeste called again, but Vivian did not pick up. The next week, she met Theodore Hargrove, her uncle. He was the man who had stayed behind when Eleanor left, the man who, as Ruby put it, had become what money made him, the head of the family her mother had run away from. He lived in a house near Richmond that could have passed for a small museum, with tall columns and a circular driveway. It was the very same house from the photograph in Eleanor's cedar box. But the man who greeted her at the door was not the harsh figure from that old picture. He was 78 years old, fragile and thin, in the way that old men become thin after eating alone for too many years. But his eyes were still sharp, a clear blue, and filled with something Vivian understood: regret. He looked at her face and began to weep. "You look exactly like her," he said. "My God, you are the image of Eleanor." He welcomed her inside. He showed her the house where Eleanor grew up, the piano room where she spent countless hours practicing, and the garden where their mother, Alice, tended her roses right up until her last day. He shared childhood stories of Eleanor, calling her stubborn and fearless, the one who would challenge their father at dinner when everyone else was too scared to. "I should have gone with her," Theodore confessed. "When she walked out, I should have been right behind her. But I was afraid, too weak. By the time I worked up the nerve, too many years had gone by." He gave Vivian complete access to the Hargrove family's resources, their legal team, financial experts, and a network built over 50 years. Vivian said yes, but with her own conditions. "No media," she insisted. "No power games. I just want to protect my daughter and build something real." Theodore gave a slow nod, a look of peace finally softening his aged face. "You have more of your mother in you than you realize," he told her. That night, Vivian and Ruby made Eleanor's shrimp and grits right in her old kitchen. They steered clear of topics like money, Grant, Delaney, or legal battles. Instead, they talked about Eleanor. Ruby shared stories Vivian had never known, like Eleanor sneaking out of the mansion at 16 to play piano at a blues bar downtown, or when she was 17 and stood up to their father at Thanksgiving, telling him that money without compassion was just paper with dead presidents on it. Eleanor had chosen love over a legacy of cruelty, opting for a 2-bedroom apartment, a 15-year-old car, and a daughter she could raise free from all that poison. The kitchen filled with steam, laughter, and the scent of butter and Old Bay seasoning. For a moment, it felt like Eleanor was right there with them, in the recipe and the memories. Grant's world didn't fall apart because of Vivian, and that was the most beautiful part. It fell apart because of him. Owen Merritt quietly ended their partnership on a Thursday, simply citing a clash in business principles. The news didn't make headlines, but investors noticed. Without Owen's know-how, Grant's projects began to collapse. A luxury condo in Brooklyn went $40 million over budget. A Miami hotel project stalled after the contractor discovered payments were late. Two major investors, the type of old money families that prize reputation over profit, pulled out after hearing about the divorce and the affair. Celeste Whitmore's social circle started whispering. In their circles, divorce was normal and affairs were expected. But to do that to your pregnant wife, just 3 weeks after her mother's funeral, was a line that even Manhattan's elite refused to cross, at least in public. Soon the invitations to charity events and galas began to arrive, addressed only to Celeste. Grant's name was quietly omitted. Delaney, in the meantime, was figuring things out for herself. She moved into the penthouse that Vivian had decorated and kept filled with flowers and slept in the bed Vivian used to make every morning. She used the kitchen Vivian had kept stocked and wore the robe Vivian had left in the closet. But the penthouse felt empty, not in the way she had dreamed. The view of Central Park was stunning, but the apartment had a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The silence felt wrong, and the pauses in conversation stretched on for too long. Grant would come home late, staring at his phone through dinner, and spoke to Delaney with the same practiced warmth he had used with Vivian, like a man who knew the script, but not the feeling. She found out he was tracking her phone. When he casually asked who she was texting at lunch, he didn't care. He just needed to know, to control every conversation, just like he controlled every building. He began to criticize her outfits, gently at first. "Don't you think that dress is a little much?" he'd say. It became less subtle over time. "Delaney, you need to look the part. We have an image to uphold." After arguments, he would turn cold, giving her the silent treatment for days, withholding affection like a bank freezing an account to punish her. It was the same tactic Vivian had suffered through for 23 months. It's a method that works because it makes you question yourself, making you believe you did something wrong. It shrinks you down, piece by piece, until you are small enough to fit in the box he designed for you. Delaney finally called Vivian on a Tuesday night around 11:30, crying. "He is not the person I thought he was," she sobbed. Vivian was in her mother's kitchen. The baby was asleep, and the apartment was warm since Ruby had fixed the heater. A cup of tea was steaming on the counter. Outside, the Virginia night was dark and alive with the sound of crickets. She just listened. She did not gloat or offer comfort. She simply listened, the way you listen to a storm report for a hurricane you've already lived through. "I know," Vivian said at last. "I married him." She hung up, drank her tea, and went to bed, sleeping soundly through the night. The divorce settlement was finalized 3 weeks later. Vivian's lawyers laid out the case step by step. The invalid prenup, the affair, the emotional abuse during her pregnancy, and the financial tricks Owen had recorded, like hidden accounts and unreported earnings. Company money had been funneled for his personal spending. The judge listened with a sympathetic ear. The financial record showed a pattern of behavior the court did not take lightly. Grant's team fought back, filing objections and motions, but the proof was undeniable, and the law was clear. Without a valid prenuptial agreement, Vivian had a right to what they called equitable distribution, which meant half of his $800 million. But then Vivian did something no one saw coming. Not Grant, not his lawyers, not even Malcolm at first. She didn't take half. She took what was fair for their baby. A solid child support plan, a college fund, health insurance, and a rule that Grant could not have custody rights until he went through 6 months of therapy and showed he could be a consistent father. That was it. She left the penthouse, the car, the offshore funds, the art, and the vacation properties behind. Her lawyer was stunned. You are walking away from hundreds of millions of dollars. He said, Malcolm understood, though. She isn't punishing him by making him poor, Malcolm explained. She is punishing him by making him irrelevant. I do not need his money to prove my worth, Vivian stated. I have worth because of who I am. My mother taught me that. The story broke 2 weeks later. It wasn't because Vivian held a press conference or leaked information. It was because actions make more noise than secrets. And what Vivian did next was too big to keep quiet. The Eleanor Callaway Foundation announced a huge expansion, funding 50 new music programs in schools across the South that needed them most. It also included a new, modern music school in Eleanor's old Virginia neighborhood and a prenatal clinic funded by a private donation from Vivian Callaway. A local reporter put the pieces together. A headline ran in the Richmond Times-Dispatch. Piano teacher's daughter is a Hargrove industrial heiress. National news soon picked it up. The story was perfect. A secret billionaire, a humble piano teacher, a betrayed pregnant wife, and a fortune kept hidden for years. It was exactly the kind of story America falls in love with. Turns out, the underdog was never truly outmatched. Grant watched the news from his empty office. Owen had left, the investors had vanished, and Celeste was no longer taking his calls. He saw Vivian's face on the television, and his own went pale as ash. He finally understood the woman he had dismissed was worth 5 times his entire empire. He tried calling Vivian, but she did not pick up. He then called Malcolm Price, but only got his assistant. Miss Callaway is permanently unavailable, the assistant said firmly. Delaney also saw the broadcast. She sat in the penthouse wearing Vivian's robe and sipping from her mug. A heavy feeling, like a stone, settled in her stomach as she watched. She had traded a life with a billionaire to be a controlling man's prize. The big diamond ring Grant had presented with such fanfare suddenly felt like a lead weight on the screen. The news anchor got the name Hargrove completely wrong. They said it with a hard G, but Vivian let it go. She had a crib to build for a new room in her brand new life. The baby decided to arrive on a Sunday in October. At 4:15 in the morning, Vivian felt a new kind of pressure. This was not like the false alarms she had experienced in her mother's drafty apartment. It was deeper, more insistent, a feeling that arrived with purpose and on its own schedule. She called her doctor, then Ruby, and quietly got dressed in the dark. She grabbed the hospital bag that was packed for weeks and drove herself to the hospital. After all, she was Vivian Callaway, and she never waited for anyone else's help. Ruby burst in 20 minutes later, breathless, her silver hair a mess, a pajama top peeking from her jacket. I broke 3 speed limits to get here, she gasped. Your mom would have broken 4. Labor went on for 11 hours. Vivian never screamed. She just breathed and counted, and gripped Ruby's hand with all her might. Ruby's knuckles went pale. Dr. Harmon remained calm and confident, as always. She guided Vivian through each contraction, like a pilot navigating a stormy sky. At 3:22 in the afternoon, the baby was born. A girl, 8 pounds and 2 ounces. She was not crying, she was screaming, a powerful roar that announced her arrival to the world. They placed the warm, wet, tiny, and very loud baby on Vivian's chest. Vivian gazed at the red, wrinkled face with its shut eyes and open mouth, and felt a profound change within her. It was a fundamental shift, as if her entire being had realigned itself around this tiny person. "Hello," she whispered. "Hello, Eleanor Ruby Calloway." Not Whitmore, Calloway. It was her mother's name and Ruby's name, a name with real meaning. Beside the bed, tears poured down Ruby's cheeks as she watched. She was laughing through her tears, saying, "Oh, Eleanor, you beautiful girl. Your grandmother would be completely overwhelmed right now. Just a total mess." Down the hall, Theodore Hargrove waited. He drove 3 hours from Richmond, holding pink peonies, Eleanor's favorite. His hands trembled slightly as he held them, waiting with the patience of a man who knows this moment was not his. When Vivian called him in, his once sharp blue eyes softened as he stared at the baby for a long while. "She has Eleanor's hands," he said, and it was true. Long, strong fingers, perfect for a pianist. Grant received a formal text from Vivian's lawyer, a standard professional notification. It was just the basic information a father should receive. His reply came 30 minutes later. "Congratulations." Vivian saw the message, put down her phone, held her daughter, and offered no response. A handwritten card from Owen Merritt came to the hospital the following day. It said, "She is so lucky to have you as a mother. Welcome, Eleanor Ruby." Vivian put the card on the nursery wall, where it remained for years to come. 6 months flew by, as they do with a new baby, both too quickly and too slowly. Every day was a whirlwind of feedings, diaper changes, and waking up in the night. And every day was a gift of small sounds, tiny hands, and a little head resting on her shoulder. Vivian found a brownstone in Virginia. It was not a mansion or a penthouse, just a 3-bedroom home with a garden and a porch for watching fireflies at dusk. Her mother's beautiful Baldwin piano was placed by the front window. Vivian had it tuned and set it right where the afternoon sun would hit it. Beside it was baby Eleanor's playmat with blankets, toys, and her favorite wooden spoon. From there, she focused on expanding the foundation. Her office was the kitchen table, covered in emails, call lists, and grant proposals. It was all mixed in with baby bottles, burp cloths, and her unfinished sandwich. She funded a music school, opened a clinic for expectant mothers, and created a scholarship for single moms. She named it for Eleanor. Naturally, everything was named for Eleanor. One Tuesday in April, she bumped into Delaney at a local coffee shop. She hardly recognized her. Delaney was thinner, but not in a healthy way. It was the weight you lose from stress, with dark circles under her eyes and a fragile, forced smile. The engagement ring was gone. "Vivian," Delaney said, her voice breaking on the name. "Delaney." A long silence followed, filled with unspoken history and regret. The shop buzzed around them with the normal sounds of hissing espresso machines and quiet chatter as chairs scraped against the tile floor. With tears in her eyes, Delaney tried to speak, but no words came out. "I am so—" she began, but Vivian gently raised her hand to stop her. It was not a gesture of anger or dismissal, but something else entirely. "I do not need you to apologize," Vivian said. "I just need you to learn from this." Then she took her coffee and walked away, leaving Delaney with a cooling latte. No one there knew they had just ended a chapter spanning 14 months and 40 years of friendship. By the month's end, Grant's company was officially under investigation. The Securities and Exchange Commission had gotten a complaint, but not from Vivian or Owen. It came from an investor who had lost his money and demanded answers. The investigation uncovered everything: the secret accounts, the missing funds, the hidden income, and the reckless risks he took with other people's money. Celeste publicly cut all ties with Grant. She stopped making excuses for him and withdrew to her Upper East Side townhouse. She filled her time with art and opera, acting as though she never had a son. Grant was all alone in the lavish penthouse Vivian had designed. It was the same place where Delaney had worn her robe and used her favorite mug. But Delaney had left him too, after he had yelled about a credit card bill. She escaped in the night with a single bag, feeling a painful sense of familiarity. He sat at the kitchen island where he had once served her with divorce papers. It was also where the casserole dish had broken. The marble was new now. You could no longer see the damage, but Grant could still feel it. Vivian finally realized her prison door was never locked. She had been her own guard. She understood this now, playing piano in her Virginia home, her daughter babbling on the floor. The real cage was not Grant. It was the mistaken belief that she was nothing without him. She thought she was small, and that his world was the only one that mattered. Her mother knew better. She had raised Vivian with nothing to show her she was worth something on her own. Then she left her billions to show her what she could achieve with resources, two priceless gifts. It was a Tuesday in October, almost 2 years to the day Grant had proposed in his office. Warm amber light streamed through the window panes. In her high chair, baby Eleanor joyfully banged a spoon against the tray, finding her own rhythm. Vivian cooked shrimp and grits from Eleanor's own recipe, the last one her mother taught her. The heavy black cast iron skillet, the only thing she kept from the penthouse, sat on the stove. Shrimp sizzled and grits simmered, and the air smelled of butter, seasoning, and a lavender candle. Just then, the doorbell rang. It was Malcolm Price, smiling on her porch with a briefcase. He carried a folder with the final paperwork for the Hargrove Trust transfer. It just needed one last signature. "What a view," he said, watching the fireflies in the garden. "My mother would have loved this place," Vivian replied. She signed the papers right there at the kitchen counter, next to a salt shaker and a sippy cup. $4.2 billion were moved with a $2 pen and a 3-second signature. It was a simple action that marked an incredible moment in her life. After Malcolm left, Vivian rinsed the pen, put it away, and turned off the stove. She served the shrimp and grits, setting a small bowl of sweet potatoes before baby Eleanor. The baby instantly put her hands in the bowl and giggled with delight. Vivian ate her meal slowly, savoring each bite of the perfectly cooked shrimp and creamy grits. The old skillet seemed to remember every meal ever made in it, adding its history to this one. When dinner was done, she washed the dishes and dried her hands on a simple, plain towel. Then she picked up her daughter and held her close against her shoulder. She felt the baby's warmth and weight, smelling the baby shampoo, sweet potato, and fresh cotton of her clothes. She walked over to the piano, sat on the bench, and placed little Eleanor in her lap. The baby's long fingers, her grandmother's fingers, reached for the keys. Vivian gently pressed middle C. The note echoed through the house, clear and perfect. It was the same note it had always been and always would be. Middle C never changes, never lies, and never leaves. It always rings true, no matter whose fingers play it. Baby Eleanor stopped squirming and listened, her eyes wide. Vivian began to play Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Opus 9, number 2. It was her mother's favorite, the very piece left open on the music stand the day she passed away. It was the same music that used to float through a 2-bedroom apartment in Virginia every night after dinner, filling the home with a feeling that money could purchase, but never truly create. She played with her eyes shut, just as her mother had taught her. "Feel the keys, Vivian. Do not watch them. Trust your hands." And for the first time, she did trust her hands. She trusted herself. The music filled the brownstone, drifting out the open windows into the garden where fireflies flickered. It floated down the street, where neighbors relaxed on their porches in the warm October evening. It traveled out into a world that was big, messy, and often unkind, but a world that also held the beautiful sound of a piano being played with pure love. The casserole dish was long gone, shattered and thrown out, but the recipe lived on. Recipes always do. Our team put a lot of heart into this story, carefully crafting it to share meaningful lessons about life. We shaped every character, every scene, and every feeling with a purpose: to entertain, to inspire, and to be a reminder that your own story is important. Thank you for being here with us. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community